April 7th, 2021. This is the Committee of the Whole. I am Chair Charlie Sully, and it is my honor to call the meeting to order. This is a virtual meeting. We're still in a state of emergency, and if there are members of the public watching us on video or listening in, feel free to make comments to a email address, which is public.info@metc.state.mn.us, and we will respond. In order to call ourselves to order, I think, is it Bridget or Liz may call the roll?
It is Bridget. I'm here.
Bridget, you're here.
Here.
Barber?
Here.
Chambliss?
Here.
Cummings?
Here.
Ferguson?
Here.
Fredford?
Here.
Johnson?
Here.
Lee?
Here.
Lilligren?
Here.
Muse?
Here.
Sterner?
Here.
Vento? Zirin? Zirin?
I'm here.
Valley.
We have a quorum. And now on to the approval of the agenda. And unless there is an objection, I shall announce it approved. On to the minutes from March 17th, 2021. Is there a motion to accept or approve the minutes?
Vento moves approval.
Thank you, Sue. Is there a second?
Atlas Engelbretson seconds.
Thank you, Linnea. All right, any discussion? If not, Bridget?
All right. Councilmember Atlas Engelbretson?
Aye.
Barber?
Aye.
Chambliss?
Aye. Aye.
Cummings? Ferguson?
Aye.
Hudson? Johnson?
Aye.
Lee?
Aye.
Lilligren?
Aye.
Muse?
Aye.
Sterner?
Aye.
Vento?
Aye.
Zirin? Chair Zelli.
Aye, those minutes are approved. So now we're on to the main event to get a presentation on our comprehensive planning. And it's really nice to see Angela, Torres, and Michael Larson right here with us. I have to say, just as an opening comment, I talk about Met Council like nearly every day. And one of the things, if I'm making a presentation, is to say that we are more than anything else a planning organization. And you know, we always get into a lot of other issues, but this is so important and it's so interesting. And just given our pre-conversation, you realize how many different aspects of what it is to be a region. So we've really been looking forward to this. And I don't know if Lisa, you want to have some opening comments, or we'll just jump right to Angela, but the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Lisa Barajas, the Community Development Director. I actually will just turn it right to Angela and Mike. I know they've got an excellent presentation for you today, and we want to be sure that there's plenty of room for you to ask your questions, give us your thoughts and ideas along the way. And just a reminder too that we're just getting started in our next round of regional planning. And so this is a good transition point for us to think about where we're at today with their current plans and to begin thinking about where we want to go in the future as a region.
With that, Chair Zelli, if it's all right, I'll start.
Yeah, that'd be great. Angela,
Okay,
thanks.
thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Angela Torres, the manager of local planning assistance. I'll be co-presenting today with Michael Larson. He's a planning analyst in local planning assistance, and we're reporting today on the initial takeaways from the 2040 local comprehensive plans. This presentation is really a composite of information gathered from not only communities across the region, but it's been prepared by staff across the council. I do want to extend a really huge thank you to all of the colleagues across the council that have helped to prepare the presentation today and the information within it. So some of them are in our audience today. So with that, Greg, next slide, please. Here's today's agenda. As part of setting the stage, I'll share a quick comp plan status update, but the bulk of the conversation today is really centered around the land use analysis. So we'll start there and do a deeper dive there, and then move into the many factors that influence land use and the region's systems. The other elements will be more of a headline than a deep dive, but if you're particularly interested in any area, we can certainly invite staff from the technical area to return and share more. We do have a lot of information to share today, but please feel free to ask questions along the way. We may simply have to note the question for further research because, like Lisa said, this is just the start of our conversation. But if it's a clarification, we'll certainly help with that. There will be some natural breaks in the presentation, and we will pause along the way as well to take any questions. We do hope to get through the entire presentation, but as Wendy can attest, we did this version of this presentation at LUAC and didn't quite make it through everything. We have a bit more time today, so hopefully that will help. And it will honestly depend on what piques your interest. So if we don't get to everything, we can come back to follow up. Greg, next slide, please. You might remember this graphic. It's always good to kind of remember the planning cycle. And as you can see by the blue circle, we're still in the local comprehensive plan review process, but we're much closer to finishing that stage. And today we're here really to talk about the preliminary takeaways from those 2040 comp plans as of the end of 2020. So this is, again, the first, not the only conversation that we'll have as we look beyond comprehensive plans to the next regional development guide, which is the next part of the planning cycle. Next slide, please. Here's where the comprehensive plan review process stands today. We were expecting to review 168 comprehensive plans. Those plans represent plans for 187 jurisdictions, and that includes the 7 counties. As a reminder, both Carver and Scott County are responsible for planning for the townships within their respective jurisdictions. Each county plans for the 10 townships that they are responsible for. They're noted in yellow on this map. That might be useful to know in some of the future slides. This map is accurate as of the end of March. It's kind of a constant moving target, but at that time, out of 168 expected plans, we had received 162 plans for review. We didn't have any plans currently in process, although several are close. In process really means that currently undergoing 15 business day review, the most recently submitted plans. 23 are considered incomplete. We're waiting a response by the local government and providing assistance to them along the way. Those are indicated in orange on the map. We do have one plan that is considered complete, and the City of Savage is scheduled for committee and council review this month. Was actually reviewed by the CDC on Monday, and that is the blue area on the map. 138 plans have been authorized by the council to date, and those are the green areas, so you can see that covers the majority of the region. There are just a few remaining outstanding plans that we continue to work with communities to receive. Um, every day we make a bit of progress on these reviews. As I said, this was current as of the end of March, and just recently we did receive the City of Mendota and the City of Lexington's plans. And so, as you can tell, we're just continuously moving through the process. Greg, next slide, please. So at the beginning of the presentation, we saw the regional planning cycle with the system and policy plans noted there. We know that the local comprehensive plans reflect the regional policies. Starting place for the 2040 comp plans was much different than the 2030 comprehensive plans. So if we remember back a bit, the recession happened just as the 2030 plans came in 2008, and the communities had already planned for significant growth. So the development of Thrive really accommodated that already planned for growth, which means that the forecasts were largely the same. More land wasn't necessarily needed in the 2040 plans to accommodate forecasted growth. And so then with that, the MUSA, the Metropolitan Urban Service Area, largely stayed the same as well. In the 2030 Regional Development Framework, which is on the left on your screen, there was a much simpler classification. Communities were considered either developed or developing within the MUSA, and they had much simpler expectations for developing density with a minimum of 3 units per acre in the developing areas and 5 units per acre in the developed areas. And but in Thrive, the 2040 plans responded to more individualized community designations shown on the right on this slide that really more closely reflected the densities that communities had planned for in their 2030 plans. Council had also adopted a new housing policy plan that wasn't available in 2008, and there were other policies regarding related to density that weren't around in the 2030 framework around transitways, where we didn't have any policies prior to that. So the information that local governments shared in their 2040 plans reflect those changes because they responded to Thrive, and they'll now in turn influence the development of the next regional development guide. And we're here today to kind of help build on your collective knowledge so you can feel informed and ready when we start talking about future land use policy development. So again, I'm just going to probably reiterate multiple times throughout this. This is just the start of our conversation. Great. Next slide, please. So today, sorry, that's not the right slide. Questions for consideration. Okay, thank you. Sorry, it is the next slide, Greg. Questions for consideration is the correct one. Sorry about that. Okay, so today we're sharing some observations about what the 2040 plans tell us about what local governments are planning as it relates to land use and the factors that impact the built environment and the people that live in that environment. Ultimately, the council uses the information from comprehensive plans to lay the foundation of future policy development, and several of our committees participate in that work, like LUAC as well. So we're here to ask for your help in framing the additional research that's yet to come that we'll need to contribute to future discussions. We'd like you to tell us what else you need or want to know to inform policy development for the council. We're really looking to refine some research questions and asking for your perspective on what you want and need to know. So we'll refer to these questions again later in the presentation, but one thing we should note, and Councilmember Wolf was really helpful at the LUAC meeting to share that we have a tendency to have kind of really significant events when the comp plan cycle has come around. Last year or last round, it was the recession. This time it is the pandemic. So those are the things that we may need to consider also as part of our research questions. So I think that sets the foundation for our conversation today. Unless there are any immediate questions, I'll turn it over to Mike to share the initial land use policy analysis.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Next
Next
slide,
slide.
please, Greg. So again, I'm Michael Larson, Planning Analyst and Local Planning Assistant in the Community Development Division. I'll be presenting the high-level land use information and look forward to your questions and what might be of interest to you in a future presentation. Next slide, please. So for context, I want to emphasize that overall communities in the region, as Angela had mentioned, have been planning for a lower level of growth for 2040 than we anticipated for 2030 10 years ago. So this change reflects a regional economy that is, although strong, is in fact lagging behind many of its peers. Um, the change in this forecast from 10 years ago is not uniform, however, and reflects a change in market demand for new development. For example, Edina's current household forecast for 2030 is 23% higher than what we had forecasted 10 years ago for the same milestone. Other communities, mainly suburban edge communities, now have what you might call excess capacity in their plans, planning for growth that has that has not yet materialized or has materialized not as quickly. And a couple of principles that I want to emphasize is that the Metropolitan Council honors previously authorized plans for growth, and that we also adapt to changing development trends over time. Next slide, please. So there are a number of high-level observations that we've made comparing 2040 plans to 2030 plans. And please keep in mind we are considering 2 points in time. Many communities have amended their 2030 plans over time to respond to changing market conditions and policymakers' support for local plan changes. So we're comparing the plan that was authorized in 2030 and versus the plan that was authorized in 2040. Overall, plans have identified fewer acres, though still much more than is needed for overall forecasted growth. Density ranges are shifting higher to support increased development of multifamily projects, and this density increase more than makes up for the fact that there are fewer acres that plans have identified as a whole. And finally, communities are increasingly using mixed use guiding land use to support development. Next slide, please. So for context in terms of land use planning, the community designation bar chart to the right with corresponding map colors shows the percentage of land that each community designation accounts for in the region. The 27 communities that make up the urban center and urban community designations account for approximately 10% of the region's land area, while 84 communities that account for the suburban edge, and emerging suburban edge designations account for about a third of the region. This part of the presentation focuses on the part of the region with urban services and not the 53% of the region that is rural or agricultural. Forecasted growth in this part of the region only represents a little less than 2% of the region's overall growth. And so please also keep in mind again that I'm reporting in a data set that includes authorized plans at the time of adoption. So not every plan, but the vast majority of forecasted growth in the region, as you saw from the previous map. Next slide, please. So I'm going to show you a series of slides formatted like this one for acreage. The blue bars represents data from the previous 2030 plans, while the green bars represent data from the most recent round of comprehensive planning. This data again includes authorized plans and will be changing over time. The two sets of bars on the left represent the sum for the entire urban service area. And that includes wastewater customers of the Met Council, as well as other communities that have urban services. The other sets of bars represent data from each of the community designations from most urban on the left to least urban on the right. So the topic of this slide is the sum of acreage from comprehensive plans from that communities have identified for both greenfield as well as acreage identified for infill or redevelopment opportunities. So as you can see, there is a significant drop in the acreage identified in plans, and this likely results from a variety of factors that include reduced forecasts for some communities, trends in increased density, therefore less acreage is needed, and or changes in how restrictive or accommodating a plan might be compared to their last plan. And as you might expect, plans from the growing edge of the region tend to have lower densities and therefore the most acreage identified among those bar charts. The information you see on this and subsequent slides is a little different than what we presented at LUAC last month. We've since realized that we had unfortunately double counted the information for East Bethel. East Bethel is a rural center, so the bars on the most furthest on the right. As you might expect, this change and update barely registers at the regional level, but we'll see a few adjustments to this information also as plans are authorized. So it doesn't affect the big picture conclusions, but just wanted you to note that in case you had seen the previous presentation. Next slide, please. So again, as Angela explained, Thrive MSB established these set of minimum densities for development, more refined community designations based on ensuring an efficient use of regional infrastructure. In the last round, it was just 3 and 5 units per acre based on whether a community was developing or developed. And so in terms of methodology, this minimum is based on a weighted average. Some areas of the community could be guided at density lower than 3 acres, and some could be balanced, or some could be guided more as provided that the overall minimum hits 3 or the respective minimum density required for the community. So as you can see in this bar chart, we've identified the minimum density for each of the community designations, ranging from 20 in the urban center to 3 for the suburban edge, emerging suburban edge, and rural center. On balance, you can see that cities did not have any trouble meeting, in some cases significantly exceeding these new expectations. Suburban edge, emerging suburban edge, and rural centers on the right remain primarily markets for lower density residential development, but as you will see momentarily, they are also accommodating a shift in the market in terms of density and mix of uses. Next slide, please. So one thing that research staff at the council do is they use the midpoint of density ranges in comprehensive plans to assess a plan's capacity for accommodating growth. At the risk of stating the obvious, if a guiding land use supports a range of 20 to 30 units an acre, that midpoint is 20. So based on past analysis and experience, development tends to trend toward the average of this midpoint across that range rather than fall to one end of the range or another. One thing that probably stands out for you in this chart is that very tall green bar on the left, which is represented a more than 3-fold increase for urban center communities, and that's heavily influenced by Minneapolis's plan. So next slide, please. So like many other communities that have experienced a wave of redevelopment, Minneapolis amended its previous comprehensive plan in 2016 to accommodate much higher densities than it had previously experienced, densities that were further reinforced in their updated 2040 plan. This density includes new residential towers, projects on small infill sites, and projects with smaller unit sizes, each of which result in an increased density. So the project that I'm showing you here in the image is the Foremark development in downtown Minneapolis. This project has 262 units, but it has a density of 720 units per acre. So a multi-family project in a suburban context with the same number of units would likely have a much lower density. Next slide, please. So on this version of this same slide, I've taken out Minneapolis, which now shows a more representative curve in the density gradient that we see across the region. The midpoint comes down from 160 to 66. And if we remove St. Paul, that number would come down to 50, but also continuing to represent a density gradient amongst our community designations. Next slide, please. So one other thing I'd like to mention about midpoint density is many communities with an urban designation are also showing increased densities. And the image shown here is a rendering of the Bauer development in the greater Southdale district. Edina has a planned midpoint density of 57 units per acre, which is much higher than its peers. And the guiding land use where the Bauer is located actually supports a density range of 90 to 150 units per acre. Next slide, please. So this slide now compares the capacity of all plans to accommodate forecasted growth. Capacity is measured by multiplying the acreage that communities have identified in the plan by the midpoint of the density range, which I just addressed. The black arrow shows the forecasted household growth for the region of 210,000 households. And as you can see by comparing that black arrow to the overall bar chart for the region, as well as the community other community designations that there is capacity throughout the region to accommodate a variety of growth in different scenarios. So that includes one other comment. Yeah, much of this capacity involves redevelopment, which is an economical use of land, but it also involves, again, a greenfield acreage and primarily represented in the suburban edge and emerging suburban edge parts of the region. So next slide, please. So I want to keep you to keep in mind that a local comprehensive plan includes additional data that we use to plan regional systems, such as this map and table shown on the slide. This includes the geographic allocation of local forecasts to transportation analysis zones, as well as sewer sheds and regional sewer connection points. So in local plans, this data needs to sum to their official forecast, regardless of the amount of housing capacity that I've identified in our plan. This approach helps us ensure that we are not planning for more capacity that is really needed and before it is needed. When necessary, communities can amend their comprehensive plans to adjust if they get unexpected growth or faster growth than they had anticipated. Because sewer pipes last longer than 20 years, we consider a community's potential growth in land use planning, and the community helps us understand that. If development trends shift, we can shift gears and adapt to ensure that regional capacity is there when it's needed. We are constantly monitoring this, including when communities submit amendments, when they report developments, trends and statistics, and when they apply for sewer connection permits. So next slide, please. So another major trend in plans is greater reliance on mixed use districts. This is a phenomenon supported by greater market interest in denser multifamily development, as well as the community's desire to create a sense of community or a sense of place where a mix of uses might reinforce and support one another. So the locations on the slide represent the broad range of where we see this occurring, like downtown Minneapolis, the hub in Richfield, or the future Gold Line Helmo BRT station in Oakdale. Policy and local comprehensive plans varies from place to place and from market to market. Mixed uses may include a collection of standalone uses, such as just housing and retail next to one another, or it may include non-residential uses on the such as an office or shop on the ground floor of a residential building like we might see in the core of the city. We ask communities in their plans to estimate in their plans the percentage of residential development that they are likely to see based on local policy and market conditions. So this gives us an idea of what the capacity is for those districts, that mix of residential and non-residential. So next slide, please. So this slide shows the increased reliance on mixed-use districts to accommodate growth. Each bar represents the percentage of housing capacity in a plan that is guided within a mixed-use district. Overall, it has more than doubled regionally, but we also see a dramatic increase, especially in the suburban edge and rural center communities, where such a practice is newer. Concurrently, the number of mixed-use districts in plans where cities expect growth or have guided growth has increased from 94 to 237. So which I think we see as reflecting a broader and or more refined land use planning practice related to creating mixed-use districts. So please keep in mind that this isn't necessarily the full inventory of mixed-use districts, and this is associated with acres that cities have identified as growth. So in redevelopment cases, it's somewhat professional judgment and community planning that identifies where that is. Next slide, please. So I want to focus a little bit in on the change that we see in suburban edge communities, which is a pretty dramatic change with the breakdown by city shown on the right. The number of mixed-use districts in this cohort grew from 8 to 23, and 3 of the cities listed in green, Plymouth, Lakeville, and Maple Grove, are identifying growth in mixed-use districts for the first time. Shakopee is one of those communities that has further embraced a mixed-use approach with one goal to create a hierarchical system related to density, as well as accommodating commercial and office uses between their downtown area and the neighborhoods surrounding it. The city has worked hard on economic development plans for their downtown area with a concurrent approach to position themselves as a hub for business and industrial development. We're doing a little call out. Call out to Shakopee here for their work. In fact, in 2019, as some of you might know, the American Planning Association Minnesota chapter selected the city of Shakopee's Envision Shakopee 2040 Comp Plan as the winner of its Planning and Context Award. So good for them. Next slide, please. Now we're going to take a look at spend a little bit of time on non-residential land use expansion, as that's something we're beginning to map and take a look at. Now it's a little hard to show. This is a little granular for a regional map, but I'll show you a local example in a second. So one area, so the emerging suburban edge designation, as you can see, has shown the greatest gain in terms of land area for non-residential land use. So I think just as an aside, I think we're seeing a lot of mixed use development or high density residential development occurring on previously gutted commercial space or located on previously guided commercial uses in a mixed use district. This is primarily greenfield identified for new business and industrial development. So in most cases, this is land that changed from previously guided as agricultural or rural, as well as from residential land use categories. So much of this changes to districts that could be called non-residential mixed use, as we're also seeing more of a jobs-oriented approach to supporting a variety of employment-bearing uses, as we'll see on the next slide. Next slide, please. So changes to new non-residential land use are typically along a transportation corridor, shown here in the city of Lino Lakes, as well as in Forest Lake to the east, are communities whose comprehensive plan reflect these new non-residential uses. The light purple along I-35E in the northeast corner of the city shown here is a new designation, a new business campus designation, which is envisioned to serve as an employment center in the community. So next slide, please. And we'll just touch a little bit on the rural and agricultural patterns, which have not changed appreciably, remain largely the same. Communities in the diversified, there are three designations in the communities in the diversified rural area include a variety of farm and non-farm uses, including large lot homes and hobby farms. This area protects land for rural lifestyles today with the potential for urbanized levels of development sometime after 2040. Diversified rural communities can accommodate some growth without requiring the provision of regional services. Communities in the rural residential area include large lots with densities that range from 1 to 2.5 units an acre. This is primarily due to historical development patterns and the presence of topographical features throughout the region that limit urbanized levels of development. And so these land use patterns preclude efficient subdivision, and therefore urban services here are neither cost effective nor planned by the region. So communities in the agricultural area are located in where the long-term agricultural uses are expected, and with best quality soils for agricultural production, and they've changed very little in terms of planning and forecasted growth. Next slide, and Angela, back to you.
Well, I wonder if we want to pause to see if anybody has any initial questions on the land use section.
Any questions, comments, thoughts? You can just speak up. Phil.
Yes, I just, thank you, Chair. I just had kind of a question on the agriculture that we just finished up. It seems like in my experience is like, we like to preserve this ag, but as soon as there's housing and density, that's the first thing that goes. And I'm kind of wondering how committed are we to keeping agriculture for our region in the future for food production and that when we have less and less people farming and not ag across the country. I mean, is that like part of things that we're committed to keeping it ag zoned in that, or is that something as soon as they want to show density, boom, that's, that they'll use more ag to take for new housing.
Communities, I'm sorry, Chair and
Go ahead. Yep.
okay, Chair and Council Member, communities that have uh, agricultural community designations are held at maximum development, like 1 per 40 units per acre, and those are largely held in those large lots. Communities aren't planning for urban services in those areas without additional policy considerations by the council. So anytime there is a proposed change, that those do come before the council has um, specific identified policies identified in Thrive for ag preservation. And we support programs like the Metropolitan Agricultural Preserves Program that provide localized tax benefits to property owners in order to preserve ag land.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you, Chair.
Anyone else? All right, back to you, Angela.
Okay, we'll talk about housing. We'll start at the trends and themes in housing planning. This is the first of our other technical sections. So others have compiled this information and prepared this on our behalf, and um, a lot of data analysis by others. So I don't want to take credit for this work, but I'm happy to present it. Housing policy staff reviewed housing chapters of 199 communities comp plans and have shared several housing planning trends and themes. For example, planning for an aging population is widespread across comprehensive plans. And similar to the land use analysis, housing analysis also showed that communities were using mixed use districts more frequently, in this case, with the purpose to accommodate affordable housing needs. Some communities explored environmentally friendly housing as well, and we observed different approaches to identifying local housing needs. Some communities' comp plans included deep analysis and community engagement, and others that focused mainly on responding to the allocation of affordable housing. Identifying local housing needs was the area where staff provided the most help to communities during the review process, and that helps us to identify where additional technical assistance might be warranted. Next slide, please. As you know, the Council's housing plan identifies each community's share of the region's need for affordable housing, which is based on a community's forecasted growth. To be consistent with Council housing policy, a comprehensive plan must identify enough land for growth at densities that are sufficient to support this share. That minimum density is generally 8 units per acre. This chart identifies the composite affordable housing allocation by community designation in the gray bars. The green bar identifies the composite total number of housing units that could develop at these minimum densities. The yellow and blue bars are a breakdown of that capacity by residential and mixed use districts, respectively. And similar to the overall land use analysis, we do see that more fully developed communities rely on mixed use districts to accommodate higher density development, including land supply for affordable housing. Most cities do want to be consistent with council housing policy that allows them to be eligible for programs like the Livable Communities Act grant funds. And so we do see sufficient land identified in plans. As you review this chart, I just want you to keep in mind two things. This analysis is based on minimum densities, and the likely capacity is much higher, as you saw in the previous slides on land use. The capacity is also not guaranteed for affordable housing. This land is also available for market rate housing, and that will likely consume much of this inventory. So similar to the overall land use analysis, we see that more fully developed communities rely on mixed-use districts to accommodate higher density development, including land supply for affordable housing. Next slide, please. I'll turn it back over to Mike to talk about transportation.
Hi. The staff in Metropolitan Transportation Services has reviewed 150 plans to see if they included specific data about highways, biking, pedestrians, transit, as well as if communities had thought about transportation technology topics like automated vehicles, electric cars, drones, etc. And some of these data points will help guide the development of the future transportation policy plans. Several communities address some of these topics, as you'll see in the following slides. Many communities in the region are at different stages of addressing transportation topics, depending on where they are in the region, as well as what transportation assets they have. The following also helps. The following information will help identify areas where communities in the region already strive to advance transportation topics and where they might need additional support. So next slide, please. So I'm going to show you several bar charts again, and in this case, the blue bar charts represent the percentage of plans that addressed a particular aspect of transportation planning, and red means they did not. On the left side, we see that 83% of communities addressed freight traffic on their roadways. Um, and below that, you see that 45% of plans identified new roadways in their plans that are not currently funded in the transportation policy plan. Local plans can do this provided that they are explicit about the funding limitation and the process by which these roadways would become part of the regional system. Um, that's a requirement in each of these communities. Each of these 45% of the communities did this correctly. So on the right, we have some figures regarding bicycling. Almost no communities included bicycle counts in the way that we always see with regard to vehicles. However, many communities have bicycle policies. Many plans address on-street bicycle facilities and as well as separated bike lanes. Next slide, please. So a lot more data points here that are interesting. On the left, we see some statistics related to ped planning, with a majority of the plans having no specific pedestrian-related policies. The green bar in the middle shows that most of these policies are included in the transportation section of the plan versus the parks section of the plan, which some communities do. See here on the right, we see that more than a third of plans addressed opportunities for transit beyond what is identified in terms of ordinary transit ways and planned transit service. And about the same number incorporated transit ways that are part of our quote increased revenues scenario in the transportation policy plan. And many of you likely remember that these are transit ways that are not likely to be implemented without identifying new specific revenue sources, but they remain as part of the plan and could be implemented. And MTS addressed what they saw as some unique strategies, which a small percentage of communities did. So I think we can tease that out in a future presentation. I am curious to know more about that. Next slide, please. So land use is mostly addressed, obviously, in the land use chapter of a comprehensive plan, but about a third of plans, a little over a third, address the relationship between land use and transportation in the transportation chapter. I reviewed the Minnetonka plan, and that's one plan that did this exceptionally well. Slightly more plans address the relationship between centers of growth and its impact on multimodal transportation. Of particular interest to MTS, 1/3 of plans address the future of shown on here, not very explicitly as CAV, but some of you may know that it stands for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles. In other words, driverless cars that talk to one another. So in a small percentage of plans, 6%, interestingly, addressed drones and presumably in their aviation section, which is good. This is an area that MTS presumes will be more significant as we get more automated freight delivery in the future. And almost half of the plans address crash-related data, and that's especially important for regional planning for communities to tell us what areas of the city of their communities have higher risk, and have provided that additional data at the local level that perhaps can guide regional support for those efforts. Next slide, and I'll turn it back to Angela.
So we'll talk a little bit about water resources, which includes wastewater, local water, surface water plans, and water supply plans. Um, Next slide, please. A total of 126 community wastewater plans are required to be reviewed and approved by the council. Approved because the council actually owns and operates the wastewater system. As of March of this year, all but 23 have been reviewed and approved. The initial findings from comp sewer plans includes that there was much more specificity and information provided about inflow and infiltration, also called I&I, as well as in forecasted growth locations. For example, we saw new or enhanced 2040 community wastewater plans for Credit River Township to establish a connection to service via Savage. And for the city of Afton, we expect for a new local wastewater treatment facility. City of Rogers, existing wastewater treatment plant was acquired in the summer of 2019, with planning initiated in 2021 to plan for a new wastewater treatment plant in Western Rogers and flow to be redirected to the new wastewater treatment plant by 2030. The city of Loretto will receive service through the regional wastewater system through the use of a local sewer systems that are currently owned by Independence and Medina, and that will remain until growth in the area warrants regional interceptor service, which we anticipate around 2030. We also know that system capacity improvements and other acquisitions were identified, and some of those examples are in Lino Lakes, Lake Elmo, and the city of Savage. Of note with the city of Savage, that is in relationship to the city Credit River Township, soon to be city of Credit River, to connect to the regional system for the first time. We also saw minor refinements on the timing of system enhancements. Next slide, please. The 2040 plans also modified the long-term service area. The city of Oak Grove, for example, was eliminated through statutory action. Baytown Township was eliminated due to limits to an inability to expand the St. Croix Valley wastewater treatment plant. There's also a new addition to the long-term service area. As I mentioned before on the previous slide about the city of Savage, the northern portion of Credit River Township was added as a result of failing systems in some of the existing neighborhoods in Credit River. The response to provide service to replace failing systems is what prompted the plans to acquire the trunk sewer in Savage by 2030 that I mentioned. Um, as with all of the technical units, there are specific identified follow-ups to each of the technical units. For the 2040 wastewater plans, wastewater staff expect to update the 2040 service area and the long-term metropolitan service area by the end of 2021. That's a mapping update, as well as updating existing service area for 2020 and the proposed 2030 staging areas. So there's a complete composite data set for I&I and other Seward forecasts that will be updated by the end of 2021 as well. Next slide, please. For local surface water management plans, all 181 cities and townships, not the counties, are required to submit local surface water plan updates as part of the comprehensive planning process. The plans for local surface water are required not only just under the Metropolitan Land Planning Act, but also in Minnesota rules. That's Chapter 8410 for metropolitan water management. That means that 181 cities and townships needed to update those plans in 2017 and 2018, and they're required prior to determination of completeness for the comprehensive planning review process. So far we've received and reviewed plans that cover 177 communities. We have 142 plans from individual communities and 3 plans that cover groups of communities. The Dakota County Rural Collaborative prepared 1 plan for 16 communities, and then um, the plan also included a local service water plan that covered 15 of those 16 communities. Empire Township prepared and submitted their own plan. As I mentioned earlier, Carver and Scott County both do the land use planning for the townships in their respective counties, and as part of that, they prepared the local water plans for those townships, which included 10 townships in Carver County and 10 townships in Scott County. We've not received local surface water plans or comp plans for 4 communities to date. Next slide, please. In relationship to water supply planning, we have just a few quick numbers to share. 121 of the 155 community comprehensive plans that we've received so far include local water supply plans describing significant investment in municipal water supply systems. 34 communities use private wells with no local water supply plans. And in those plans, over 50 communities identified the need for new wells by 2040, and over 60 communities identified the need for investments in their water supply distribution systems, and 35 communities plan to invest in their water treatment systems. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, please. The trends and themes in water supply planning include infrastructure, water demand, groundwater, surface water interaction, and source water protection. I'll talk a little bit about each of those. Local water supply plans document significant planned investment in water supply system infrastructure maintenance, as well as expansion or enhancement of systems to support growth or increase treatment to address contamination. In a couple of cases, comprehensive plans document communities' plans to build new water supply systems, which is a shift from current supplies from individual and private wells. Projected water demand is an important factor influencing water supply system plans. Compared to the 2030 comp plans, actual and projected water use have gone down as people and businesses have become more efficient with water use. Outside of the local water supply plan, local comprehensive plans are most likely to address groundwater in their local surface water management plan. Approximately three-fourths of the local surface water management plans discuss groundwater, reflecting a growing recognition of the important interactions between these two aspects of the water cycle. Staff looked for trends in how comp plans addressed designated source water protection areas. There's a wide range in how comp plans reflect these designations. This information isn't required as part of the comp plans, which contributes to that. Usually, communities address this through a Minnesota Department of Health required planning process, but still, just over half of the comp plans discuss wellhead protection, although several communities that rely on groundwater didn't mention it at all. Opportunities exist to connect and align some of the source water protection approaches with the natural resource protection approaches identified by several communities. So we look at that as an opportunity as well. Next slide, please. And I'll turn it back to Mike to talk about the next
All right.
section.
Yeah, I'll touch upon some areas related to parks, climate change, and natural resources. Next slide, please. So this slide just simply shows some high-level statistics about the regional parks and trails system. Almost all communities in the region are served by an existing, a planned, or a proposed unit of the regional park system. Regional park staff identify 16 plans that included parks and trails content that they felt exceeded expectations or went above and beyond, such as doing an analysis of gaps in service, trends in park usage, or summarizing the input of the public. Next slide, please. Council staff also reviewed 160 plans for inclusion of or reference to various resilience, climate change, or natural resource elements. The study found that of the 160 plans, 57 included a resilience chapter or excuse me, 57 included resilience chapter or section, and 52 included integrated resilience into multiple plan elements and chapters. The most common approach by 134 communities involved the incorporation of natural resource conservation or preservation elements beyond that is which is required by statute. Although other approaches were less other approaches that were less common included energy plans, climate action plans, a climate vulnerability assessment, content related to electric vehicles and EV charging infrastructure. Next slide, please. So communities that included a resilience chapter or section in their plan primarily addressed renewable energy, greenhouse gas emissions, electric vehicles, and energy efficiency. The most common topic was renewable energy and more specifically solar energy. Many plans emphasize the importance of increasing community-wide use of renewable energy by protecting solar access, new ordinances, or amendments to existing policies. Community resilience and climate change discussions were often accompanied by efforts to reduce local greenhouse gas emissions, with many communities citing the state's greenhouse gas reduction goals as their motivation. Some communities also stated they will consider tracking local emissions to inform and support these efforts. A significant number of plans incorporated information on efforts to make the community, quote, EV ready, by encouraging the installation of electric vehicle charging stations both on both public and private land. And many communities also mentioned evaluating the potential to incorporate electric and low emissions vehicles into their local fleet. Finally, although not discussed as frequently as the others, energy efficiency was another key topic in local plans. In these discussions, communities said they would encourage incorporating this as new development, as well as implementing energy efficient retrofits in existing buildings. For example, slide. Yeah, there we go. Sorry, I was distracted by the advancing. So, for example, the city of Falcon Heights set ambitious energy goals aimed at increasing energy efficiency and reducing carbon emissions. These include reducing emissions by 80% and securing 50% of community electric energy from renewable sources by 2030. So now I'm ready for the next slide. Okay, so the most frequently addressed topic regarding natural resources was tree canopy and urban forestry. Communities often stated efforts to preserve and enhance the local tree canopy through urban forest or tree preservation policies. Several communities also considered conducting a tree inventory or developing a forestry management plan to diversify and preserve local trees. One community stood out for integrating climate and public health considerations into its tree canopy discussion by stating the importance of prioritizing tree planting in areas of low coverage, high heat vulnerability, and greater exposure to vehicle exhaust. Many natural resource sections also discuss the relationship between development and natural resource conservation. To address this often challenging balance, communities propose the use of various development techniques, including conservation design, low impact development, environmentally sensitive, and sustainable development practices. Several communities also mentioned developing a natural resources inventory or natural resources management plan to support initiatives to preserve and conserve these local assets. Standout communities included the city of Shakopee for its extensive section on the natural environment, in which it strives to protect and celebrate the community's natural features through initiatives that balance community growth and development with natural resource conservation. The city of Ramsey also stood out for its recent initiatives and pilot programs that protect wetlands in the neighboring Mississippi River through wetland setbacks and shoreline protection efforts, and in addition to efforts to protect the natural environment while promoting local health benefits. Next slide. And
I just
Angela,
want
back
to
to you.
see if Councilmember Lee, did you have your hand raised? Maybe you have a question.
Yeah, I did. Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Mike. My question was a lot of things could fall under resilience, and I was wondering if you saw any trends that captured public health issues um, under resilience, or if that is captured somewhere else.
Chair Zelli,
Thank you.
Councilmember Lee, like some of this other content, I am representing the summary work of others. I believe have been discussions in incorporation, I think, of public health in this relationship too. I am just not familiar with, I guess I would turn to Angela,
Yeah.
Lisa to see if they have any thoughts about that.
Actually, one of the areas that we are investigating with partner agencies is public health, and we're doing that in partnership with the Minnesota Department of Health and the Public Health Law Center. And some of the climate specific components of that include things like extreme heat events, greenhouse gas reduction, climate change inclusive of at-risk populations, rain events, flooding. So we are looking further into that. We don't have a ton of information to report at this time, but it is one of our research questions.
Okay, thank you.
So if we'll go to the next slide, I'll talk just a little bit about equity. Um, I want to start with a little bit of equity by the numbers. We reviewed 136 authorized comprehensive plans for explicit mention of equity terms. To give you an example, those terms include equity, equitable, inequity, inequitable, equities, inequities. You kind of get the picture there. The plans were categorized into 3 groups to broadly demonstrate the extent to which equity is addressed, either explicit, minimal, or none. Explicit refers to plans that included one or more of the search terms in the main body of the plan and use the search term in the context of the Thrive equity definition. Minimal refers to plans that included the same, however, the search terms were not used in the context of the Thrive definition. None is pretty self explanatory, right? So, of the 136 plans, 52 explicitly included equity terms, 40 minimally included equity terms, and 44 did not include equity terms. Most communities that explicitly mention equity in their plan are designated as one of the 5 urban or suburban community designations. The community designations with the highest number of communities that explicitly mentioned equity were urban and suburban. Additionally, of the 52 plans that explicitly included equity, 21 of those plans stated equity as a guiding principle. Plans with an equity guiding principle integrated equity into most plan elements rather than sporadically throughout. Most of these communities are designated as urban center, urban, or suburban. Several communities also used icons to identify specific goals and policies that addressed equity throughout the plan. Next slide, please. The communities that explicitly mentioned equity in their plans often introduced it through discussion of growing racial and cultural diversity in the community and across the region. Several communities also introduced equity by acknowledging the region's significant disparities and the need to address them. Although many communities addressed equity in several plan elements, equity was most frequently mentioned in the transportation, housing, and parks and trails section of comprehensive plans. The review of plans also revealed that the framing of equity varies across communities. While most communities simply stated equity, there were several that framed it as social equity, health equity, or racial equity. In addition to discussing community-based initiatives to address equity, several communities included information on efforts to advance equity within internal processes. Some examples include the development of committees or work groups to lead local equity initiatives and the evaluation of recruitment, hiring, and retention practices so that staff are representative of the community. While many communities demonstrated significant efforts to address equity through their plan, there were several that stood out for their innovative approach. For example, the City of St. Louis Park has invested in efforts to advance equity in the community, as well as within internal practices and processes. We actually did a local planning highlight with the City of St. Louis Park, and we can share that resource with you. Ramsey County also stood out for its use of a racial equity toolkit to apply an equity lens to the analysis of county programs, policies, procedures, and capital planning. So that concludes all of the topic areas that we have planned to share today. I do want to mention that we have tracked work on economic competitiveness, aging, and public health, as I mentioned before. And some of the tracking on those topics were done in partnership with other agencies and will be part of our ongoing analysis and research that informs future policy work. I do want to, sorry, Greg, I do want to refer back to the questions for the committee just to consider, and then I'll just briefly touch on next steps. Greg, if you could quickly just share the screen again. I'll talk about next steps while you pull that back up. Each technical area has identified next steps. As I mentioned, we'll take questions from the conversation today and use them to further the land use analysis. We've identified some areas already where we would like to expand our analysis with additional investigation into things like transportation analysis zones and transit-oriented development. And as examples, I mentioned some of the follow up that wastewater staff plan to do. Surface water staff also have really good examples of work that they plan to do as part of next steps. They're initiating the Metropolitan Area Water Plan initiative, and they're planning on and currently working with the Board of Water and Soil Resource, interviewing watersheds and communities, updating and revising plan requirements and process based on interviews, so that they can update guidance and direction for the next round of comprehensive plans and do so with improved water resource process and plans. So I see many technical areas planning to do some of those same things. In land use, we're doing that as well. We have a process improvements project right now called the 2040 Debrief, where we are not only holding focus groups with community planners across the region, but our sector reps are working one-on-one to have individual conversations about what went well, what didn't, and to hear, and it's really listening sessions to hear from all of our communities, and several other components of that include surveys internally and externally. Um, as well. We have technical assistance for implementation on the Planet program, which which we're continuing from the preparation for comp plans and now working towards implementation. And all of this will feed into development of policy and information to inform the 2050 Metropolitan Development Guide. So now I'll just go ahead and land on this questions for discussion page and to remind members what we might be asking for today and open it up really for additional discussion. We'd really like to hear from you. Thank you.
I said something really important. I thanked Angela and Michael, and I saw that maybe Judy, did you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hope my dogs don't bark. I'll go fast.
No problem.
So this was really excellent. And I really loved, well, all of the information. And I love where cities are going, right? It's really, I think, working in great measure with the council's goals. There's always more to do, but it's encouraging. The one area I'm always interested in is how does the land availability, which we have land availability for future housing, but affordable housing, do we track land costs at time of sale? Because the cost of land is one thing with or without, infrastructure around it. And, availability of land is always driven by the market, and the market is kind of nuts right now. So I'm just wondering, how do we, land availability, sorry, doesn't guarantee affordable housing. So how do we track the cost?
Mr. Chair, perhaps because Angela and Mike are not jumping in so quickly, maybe I
It's a
can
long
offer.
pause.
Thank you.
Right. Councilmember Johnson, the question of land cost at point of sale is one that is not so easily tracked. It's something that data and my colleague, my team member, Joel Hudding, is probably our best resource on this. As I know you've seen in Community Development Committee, we spend a lot of time looking at rental prices as it relates to our housing authority and affordability overall. But the cost of land certainly is something that is a complex market across the region and among different communities, as well as within current service areas and outside of current service areas. There are stark differences there too. Knowing that there are some places there have been, especially when we do our regional parks planning, which is so focused on land acquisition, we have tried to do as detailed of a land value exercise as we can in order to understand what our acquisition costs can be. But it's an enormous amount of information and really only using estimated market value that our county assessors are providing in the data source. But cost at the time of sale is certainly a more elusive data source. But I certainly can follow up with our research manager on additional information for you if that would be helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Lisa. I do appreciate that. And I would just say this, affordable housing is not easy to do, and especially in this environment, but it hasn't been easy to do for some time. I don't know if it was ever easy to do, but it's much more difficult to do. And it really does have a lot to do with the sale of property, which cities don't control that either. So I do really appreciate the opportunities that cities are working towards mixed use, and that a lot of that is really going to try to build in affordability and neighborhoods that, go across the spectrum of incomes and other amenities. That's just fantastic. And I would just say that there may be some voices out there that want to point to communities that are shunning affordable housing or not permitting affordable housing. And I don't see that in any of the comprehensive plans. Now, politically, when it shows up, do council members have the will to approve it? And they go through a public process to do so. But the comp plans are really showing what they intend to do. And so, I find it encouraging, and we have a long way to go. But, I guess all I'm saying is when you really go into this process, it shows you how complex it can be. And I would also say, there can be sometimes competing interests where you're trying to preserve the environment, but you've got pressures to build more housing, and you want to build more tax base, and you want to provide good paying jobs. And that might mean potentially requiring some of your residential development opportunities. So I guess all I'm saying is I really appreciate the local units of government and the people that are working every day with us. And I really thank our staff. You guys are just the best of the best. And I know you provide so many resources for cities to do the work that they're doing. And I really know they couldn't do it without you. So just thank you from me.
Any other questions? Oh, Philip. Councilmember Sterner.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a couple questions. One is, Judy actually created the one question for me, but do we track the tax rate or tax amounts on the different land uses around the different communities at all? That's my first question.
Lisa's nodding her head, so I'm thinking yes.
Yeah, I'm.
Miss,
These are
Mr.
tough
Chair.
questions. These are tough questions. I have something
Yeah.
to add, but you go first.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Sterner, we do, as part of our responsibility, I'm reporting now on the tax-based sharing program in the Metropolitan region, more commonly known as our fiscal disparities program. And actually just this week, Deb Dietrich on our team had presented on the update on that program to our Community Development Committee. So we'd be happy to share that link to the report and the video with you as well. And just want to note that it is the 50th anniversary of the passage of that legislation that started that program as well. But yes, we do keep track of that tax base and tax classification rates across the region, not just for that, but also as it relates to the agricultural preserves program as well.
Okay, thank you. Then my second question has to do with when you asked like what else I would like to see, and then would be like power plants and refineries. They're not showing on there, and I know we like talk about where we get our water, but how do we get our power and our fuel? Like where are those on the map, and what kind of zoning do we have for that and traits? But that's what I'd like to see more information on that in the future.
The electric grid.
Yep, and the other thing is like we're looking at more renewable ones. So now we have wind farms and we have solar panels and things like that that make it different than the traditional power plant, such as the two on the east side of our region. Or refineries, I should say, refineries. And so thank you.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts, questions?
Mr. Chair, Sue Vento.
Sue, go ahead, Sue.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I don't know if this fits in this conversation or not, but one of the things that I have found pretty revealing and in many cases very surprising is that the number of calls and emails that I've gotten in the last 2 years from residents and communities where they're taken by surprise with regard to developments in their neighborhood. And more often than not, the elements, these changes were a part of a comp plan, and they had no idea. And I just wonder to what extent we can encourage greater transparency and inclusion in terms of the conversation around the plans with the residents in the community. I think it would make everybody's job, particularly those local leaders' jobs, easier, because they go to so much work to put these plans together, but then to have the plan in place and start getting pushback at that point, it's got to be difficult. And I don't know the perfect answer to this, but I think all of us, when we're in a leadership role, whether elected or appointed, have to have as much transparency as possible. And it shows up in a lot of different ways. And I'll leave it at that.
I guess
Mr.
that's
Chair?
a question. Yeah, go ahead, Judy.
If I may, and staff could correct me if I'm wrong, but so it's not the most popular public hearing, but cities are required to, as they go through the comp plan process, involve community through their committees and hold public hearings through their planning commission or committee. And as it rolls up to the council, it's noticed in public newsletters. It's noticed usually in the city's newsletters. But again, it's kind of dry stuff until, oh my gosh, something's happening near me. Also, state law does require cities to notify adjacent property owners to a piece of property that's going to develop, whether it's going to be re-guided or rezoned. But in general, they get notice. The state requirements, I think, are a couple hundred feet from the property line. Some cities, like the city of Plymouth, went beyond that and increased their notification 750 feet to cast a wider net, and that's up to the cities to do that. But your point is well taken, council member, because you pass the comp plans, but it's really until it gets personal that people show up in force. And even so, there's still a public process to engage them on the proposal that's coming through. But it's not an easy one because even in Plymouth, unfortunately, when we adopted our budget, our council chambers would pretty much be empty. But the times they would fill up is they were looking for the stained glass class at City Hall and wasn't in our room. So is there more that can be done? Probably. Hopefully cities are really putting that information out there, but broad comp plans kind of fly over people's heads until it gets real for them. And even so, there's a lot of process where neighbors do get notified and rev up, and next door has really played a role in that. So that's just my perspective from having taken the brunt sometimes 20 years into it.
Great insight. Thank you, Councilmember Johnson. Does anybody want to add to that? Judy? I mean, Sue, go ahead.
Well, I just want to say, I appreciate that, Judy. I really do. I guess my concern is that once you get to the point of having the hearing on the comp plan itself, a lot of decisions have already been made. And I just want to suggest that the earlier we get people involved, the better. If they feel like they really have a voice in the conversation, I think it's essential. And I know it's hard. And one of the challenges we face is the communication piece. I joined next door for what felt like about 3 minutes, but was actually more like 3 weeks. And then I had to get off because I kept reading things about the Met Council that weren't true and so far-fetched, and they blame us for everything. So, I just think that to the extent that we can encourage greater participation, the better. And granted, it's going to be difficult.
Deb, you might have some thoughts on this.
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I would say, so there was a lot of shout outs to my favorite hometown of Shakopee. And one of the things that they did with their comp planning process is they did engage the public early. There were big workshops. There were things that were targeted on housing. There were ones focused on transportation, different one on parks. They really did engage the community and really went on a roadshow even within the city itself. And because of that, not only is the community more aware of what the vision is going forward, but they ended up with a really well done and well thought out plan because of it. Really taking proactive efforts in doing that to now, like, they got some feedback during those workshops. So they wanted, to have some things on their city website that highlighted, how can I find out what's getting built here? So they have interactive maps and things where you can go out and you can see, oh, that's what they're building there, or that's what they're doing there. And, it's not to say that we still don't have projects that get people up in arms or concerned. That still happens. But I think that the reason they won these awards and are being recognized is because they did exactly what you're talking about. Really got out in front of this and really engaged the community. So shout out to Shakopee.
Yay. I also might add in there are transportation projects that have been on the books for decades, and when a bulldozer shows up, or it's not a bulldozer, but an actual project, then suddenly, it's, as I think Councilmember Johnson said, it gets real. So.
Well, Mr. Chair, if I might also add, I think there are some communities who have done a really excellent job in illustrating what proposed development might look like in a certain neighborhood or district, and saying this is what we mean by this type of development, and having those visuals, which really can help community members who aren't in the thick of it, like ways to really understand what density actually means and looks like on the ground. And those can be really helpful tools. But I know it's something Angela and Mike are very familiar with, are the amount of workshops and training and resources that our team has provided in the preparation of comprehensive plans, and really highlighting communities who have gone kind of above and beyond the minimum requirements in state law for public hearings in reaching out to residents in their community, different types of workshops, different ways of reaching community members who don't typically participate in these types of processes, and finding, building a community of practice together there. So I think this is an area that we're all still continuing to grow and learn in, and certainly an area where we continue to support our local colleagues in their work as well.
Lisa, do you want to just comment on, because you've described this to me, like the Minneapolis 2040 plan, which really is promoting density and development along transit corridors. but it became very controversial, and like it's a major shift. But I've understood that even under the existing comprehensive plan, it kind of fits. So you know, these communication challenges are really both urban and rural.
Certainly
And suburban.
there, Mr. Chair, I think there certainly are, for staff, especially staff who have been looking at plans for decades where we know what exists, and sometimes things don't come to light for residents until more recent, and it, can appear to be something new because it's new to them, but it may be adopted policy. But things like the guided density range as an example, and what that means for allowable types of housing within a neighborhood can be hard to interpret if it's not something you do every day. If you're, someone in my household who isn't Lisa, they might say, what is a density range of 8 to 100 units an acre look like? That's meaningless. But saying that these are the types of units we mean, that means everything from single family to duplex to twin homes to small scale apartments can actually start to make that make sense for everyday people on the ground too, and something that we've encouraged communities to consider.
Riva?
Yeah, I was just kind of brainstorming, what we can do to get more engagement or more attention to some really well done developments. Maybe we could have some type of recognition or award. Form a committee. I don't know if it would be a committee of city peers or Met Council only, but just kind of a thought. To encourage cities to not only look at opportunities for in their comprehensive development plans, but also to highlight some of the best practices or innovative ideas that cities have come up with. And then that way the cities could promote it on their own as well, once they got the recognition.
I love the idea of celebrating success and actually putting a spotlight on what it looks like as a model. That's a great idea, Councilman. Looks like
Mr. Chair,
Shakopee
just to
might
that
get
point,
nominated. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Judy.
I don't know, and staff might know this. Do we work, to Reva's point, I think it's a great idea. And really it goes to Councilmember Vento's point too, kind of highlighting what's working well and replicating it out there. But do we work with metro cities, or could we, they've just got such a great conduit, and they want to have a great relationship with us, and it'd be nice since they've got the membership base. I don't know, just an idea.
I
Angela?
can respond if that's okay, Chair. Thank you. This gets to a lot of what you are all talking about. We have a sort of an award already kind of established. We call it local planning highlights. And anytime we hear about a great example that might benefit another community, we interview the local government, the staff. They provide us with resources. Maybe it's a model or template of how they accomplished this really great thing. We write up a highlight and we share that across all of the communities. We have several kind of ways that we distribute those things. We have a monthly kind of news blast that goes out with really interesting, well, we think they're interesting things, and resources, webinars, things like that. But as we develop local planning highlights, we also share those out. And we've partnered regularly with organizations like Metro Cities and the Urban Land Institute and others to help distribute those resources on a regular basis. Our news blast gets redistributed to all of those other partners. And so we do try to do that. There's a lot of really great planning practices though, so we're probably not doing as many as we could be doing. And of course, we've been reviewing comprehensive plans for the last couple of years. So we do have this plan and implementation project that I mentioned as part of our next steps, and we'll be starting some of that work to actually do some of those highlights and share with other communities so that they can learn best practices and learn from others. And local governments are really happy to connect with other local governments and talk about the work that they're doing. So we find most of our local planners really willing to field questions, share resources, even walk through process and stuff like that. How did you build the political will to do this thing? And they can share strategies and share newly developed policy language and things like that with one another. So we do have some form of that. It's not exactly an award, but we do post that on our website. We provide that to the local government to share out widely as well.
Any other questions, thoughts? Well, Angela, Michael, Lisa, this is really great work, and I'll kind of echo what I think many people have said. It really is deep and it's broad, and the trends are really interesting. And as much as we've been talking about growth, you actually showed some statistics that it's really happening. So starting now, this next round is really going to be challenging and interesting for us. I also think that this is not our only chance. I think this presentation is on the website, so I encourage people to kind of take it, and we can certainly have more conversation both offline and in meetings. Any other last words or thoughts you would like to share? Any other questions, anybody?
Mr. Chair, if I may also just offer for council members as you're thinking about what else you might want to know about, what else sparks your interest as we're thinking about, what the future vision for, the 2050 vision for this region might be. It's always good to know where we're at today. And so if there's additional things that you'd like to know, I'd like to know how communities, can we dig a little bit deeper on what sorts of solar policies, for example, might be in local comp plans? What's our starting point? Those types of questions are really helpful for us to help. We first have a ton of ideas of ways we might dig in deeper because, we're kind of planning nerds, but we'd love for you to help kind of guide and direct that as well. Otherwise, I think we might end up with a lot more information or down rabbit holes that are not helpful to you. So we want to be sure that the information that we're providing and that we're investigating for you is really helpful and helps to inform both you and your colleagues, but also the region as we said about where we are at today and then where do we want to go from here.
Thank you,
So,
Lisa. Yep.
Thank you.
I was just going to say that, thinking about the plans not just as technical process, but here's an opportunity for us as a council in the process itself to advance those 4 big goals of equity and affordability in housing and climate and interconnected transportation. I mean, that all fits together. And how can we think about those levers of helping to advance? Already there are people, looking at what is addressed in those plans in terms of equity or in climate. I think that if we were to look at this 10 years from now, what do we want to see? And, I think there's ways to, because the world's moving so quickly and we're so ingrained in many of the details, it's kind of nice to step back and look at the whole region because nobody else is looking at it as the way we are. So that's a unique position. All right, well, great food for thought. Great presentation. Thank you. And thank everybody who is here today. Our work is before us, and it's good for us to sit back and learn and then engage, and then we have our work cut out for us. So thanks for everybody, and unless there's any other comments or thoughts, I know I'm going to see you all soon. So this committee of the whole is adjourned. The rain has stopped, so we can all go outside. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Good meeting.